Another artist of the era that we really don't know very much about is sometimes called Grunewald, but we think his name might have really been Nithard. It was an error in somebody's attribution hundreds of years ago that created that name, but either way, we don't know much about him, because unlike Dürer, this person didn't see himself as somebody who wanted to be identified with the work. It was apparently enough for him to create the work and decorate a church with it, and that was his way of perhaps honoring God. What's interesting about this actually is the artist, it's apparent, did know about various techniques for creating realistic images, but he chose only to use those of them that served his purposes in emphasizing what he wanted to emphasize. And actually here what he did was he used a technique of the Middle Ages which really harks back to the way the Egyptians thought about things. The most important figure in this painting is drawn the largest, Jesus on the cross. This is John the Baptist, who himself is quoted as saying that he will decrease and Jesus will increase. What that really means is his fame and people knowing about him. He will diminish and fade into the background, and he's drawn smaller than Jesus. What Gombrich points out, too, is the fact that if you compare the size of the hands here, Jesus' hands are very, very large by comparison to Mary Magdalene's hands are very small. And here John the Baptist has sort of hands in between. Jesus is drawn not as a pleasant-looking body, as in most Renaissance art, but as a dead person might look, with many, many wounds and flesh turning green. A lot of symbolism here with this lamb bleeding into a cup, the Lamb of God, the sacrifice that Jesus was. An example here of a painter, Nithard, who some people call the Correggio of the North. This painting actually illustrates why that name applied. Here we have that same technique of intense light interacting with intense darkness. We have here Jesus rising from the grave, and the Roman soldiers that were assigned to guard the tomb are being very much blown out by it. They're knocked down by this phenomenon. They're struggling here on the ground. And the intense light from Jesus is being reflected in these cloths here in such a realistic way that this, combined with this background, gives this such a character of depth. It's almost photographic and even beyond. In fact, when I look at this, here we have this intense light coming from Jesus being reflected in all sorts of different colors. And here there are even other colors besides blue, and here as well. But don't forget to look at this stone in the background. This is almost photographic. In fact, it looks very 3D realistic, the way this thing is jutting out from the wall, but yet this image is clearly in front of it, and we sense that this is some distance from the background. So this treatment of light is why some people would call Nithard the Correggio of the North. These are the same type of light effects for which Correggio gained a following and quite a reputation in Italy. We see some interesting things happening here. Cranach, and something that amounts to one of the earliest paintings that involves a landscape as well as holy figures. This is the flight to Egypt with Jesus as a baby. And it's drawn in a very delightful way here with a bunch of angels entertaining him. And even more interesting is what happens here in the background, with perspective clearly showing this to be in the distance, and here a lot of detail very close to us, and not so much detail here, an example of focus perspective. Why all of this with the trees? It seems that a perception and an appreciation of nature is taking hold here. So instead of a planar background, Cranach has used here essentially what starts to look like a landscape. But it was very unusual to pay much attention, just as it was for Dürer to invest time and energies in attempting to create a realistic appearance of kind of a trivial patch of turf. It was also unheard of for an artist to spend a great deal of time attempting to replicate something like a tree. And a comparison between Cranach's work and that of Lochner, not that much before, shows you how this is changing. Here, although there was some attempt to portray real depth, here we have a real outdoor scene. And not that much later, but after a very significant event, here we have another artist, Altdorfer, and he's creating purely a landscape. There are no people in this. So it seems as if this appreciation of nature has taken hold in some very significant ways, with an awful lot of attention being paid to detail here on things like leaves on trees, the sky in a very dramatic way, clearly atmospheric perspective here, but these tools of the Renaissance now being applied to subject matter that was unknown in paintings before this time. Now, the event that I mentioned earlier, this occurs after the Protestant Reformation had taken hold. In subsequent years, the Protestant Reformation caused many churches that had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church to essentially throw out the baby with the bathwater. By that I mean in tossing out a lot of the concepts that the church had evolved by that time. Many Protestant churches tossed out the whole idea of decorating the church in a very profuse way. So artists who had previously been employed to create altar paintings and altar pieces and decorations and paintings of saints for the church were out of work because churches no longer in Protestant areas commissioned that type of work. And various other genres of painting arose in subsequent years, landscape painting being one of them. Now here we have an interesting thing, Mabuse, so Jan Gossard. It's interesting in a number of ways. It's kind of interesting for the unusual combination of Apostle Luke, who is said to be an artist here drawing a picture of Mary and Jesus. Actually, some would say Luke was a doctor, and I'm not sure he really was associated with the career of an artist in his own right. But we see here interesting things, very vivid, brilliant pigments. Definitely an attempt to stage a scene here that would demonstrate the artist's skill with linear perspective, as well as light perspective in the way that this cloth is shown shaded and draped. The inclusion of these Greek types of statuary here, hearkening to the kind of interest shown in Greek decoration, and of course these types of columns here that are also evident of some Greek influence, as well as this sort of a column and pedestal there. Odd combination here of things. Funny setting for an apostle drawing a picture of Mary and Jesus. It almost looks really contrived simply for the purpose of demonstrating these skills of the artist.